testimony, right? It's one of my favorite nights. We get to hear a testimony from someone, real live testimony, where they were, what happened, and where they're at now. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you my good friend, Mr. Tim.
Hi everybody, my name is Tim and I am a faithful believer in Jesus Christ.
Hi, Timmy.
Wow, I don't know why this stressed me out so bad because I've been telling my story for so many years, you know. And to be honest, I put it off for the last 2 weeks. So I gotta warn you, I don't know what it was about writing it down. I was comfortable with the thought of getting up here and winging it and all this, but to put it on paper, I really struggled with it. So I don't know how it's gonna come out. I wrote it, I didn't reread it, I had the wife read it, and then Doug read it, so we'll just kind of play it by ear, and I'll hopefully be able to extrapolate some, since it was pointed out to me that it's probably short. When I think back to my early childhood, it really seems like it was someone else's life, you know. Up until about the time I was 10, we did all those things that a happy family would do. We went on family vacations, we took trips, we had game night, My mom was a little short Italian lady, so every night it was dinner at the dinner table, We spent a lot of real quality time together as a family. There were four of us. There was, myself, my mom, dad, and then I had an older brother that, we never really got along. But 4 years is a big difference, you never really had the same interests. Through all this, I guess, looking back in what I think of as the good times in my family, I never really realized that my father had a drinking problem or that he was an alcoholic. He really hid it well, or maybe my mother covered it up, being the good Catholic that she was. She didn't want anybody to know, that there were things going on in our home that probably weren't right, But I never really noticed. All of the family would have a drink here and a drink there. It was just what they did. But that soon changed. When I was 11 years old, I remember, and actually it was the night before that we actually had to sit down, that I'll get to in a minute. I remember being woken up in the middle of the night, and my father was screaming, and there was a bunch of racket, and I never really, I was kind of afraid to get up to see what was going on, and so, anyways, it was like any other morning. The next morning, everybody was okay, it seemed like, and so we just went off to school. And I remember coming home. Actually, I remember my father picking us up early that day, around lunchtime, and at first I thought, well, this is great, how often does this happen, I get out of school early. But I remember when we got to the house, I remember them sitting us down at the kitchen table, and what had happened the night before was my mom had a grand mal seizure. And so they told us that they had spent all that day at the doctor's, and we, I found out through this conversation that she had been having some issues that they weren't sharing with us, So the end result of this conversation was they told us that my mom had 6 months to live, that she had 2 inoperable brain tumors, one in each hemisphere. So at the time, this was the early 80s, they didn't have the technology. They couldn't operate on either without the other one shutting her system down. So yeah, they told us they couldn't operate, that she had about 6 months to live, and that we should prepare for the inevitable, that she just wasn't going to make it. As you can imagine, our lives changed at that very moment dramatically. Everything that was gone, It was at that time that there was an overwhelming sense of urgency. And it was too much for myself and my family, There's the things that start going on in a family, as I'm sure some of you have experienced when you're told this kind of news, is it was really just a blur, you know? You start thinking about all the things you've done, and 11, it was really confusing because I had never thought that, you know, that something like this could happen to this happy family that I was a part of, you know? But it was also at this time that I noticed that my father's only coping mechanism was his drinking. That it was like almost from the day I noticed, and I don't know what had changed. My mom still appeared healthy, you know, she was still cooking dinner, she was still doing the things she did, but I noticed that like every night he was in the garage and he was drinking, you know. And it wasn't long after that, and it was kind of behind my mom's back and my brother's back. My brother was like my dad's favorite, and I was the baby, I was mom's favorite, you know. There was always a kind of separation when we did things. So it was kind of behind my mom and my brother's back that Dad started kind of taking his frustrations out of me. You know, he would grab me up and he'd shake me and he would say things, you know, like you'll never amount to anything, and he'll just all these things that looking back, you know, I felt sorry for him now, but you don't understand that at 11 years old. You know, it really started slow, to be honest. It was, you know, not an everyday thing. And he wasn't like smacking me yet, but there was some physical abuse that was going on, you know. He dragged me out of bed in the middle of the night, or you know, get me up to do dishes at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, and it was just those kind of things. Well, the 6 months of the diagnosis had by this time had come and gone, and she was still with us. And then came a year, and she was still with us. And then came 2 years, and she was still with us. And then came 3 years, and she was still with us. And I say still with us, and physically she was still with us. There were times in these 3 years that she would be comatose for months, you know, or there were times where the chemo was so intense that she'd spend weeks and weeks in the hospital. And then there were times where she would look at us and she didn't know who we were, you know, that she didn't recognize us. And these were fleeting things, but they had a huge impact on my life, you know. I think looking back then is when I really kind of started to lose my identity. I wasn't really Mom's son anymore. And I didn't really belong to my father either, you know. And all the while, his alcoholism, and violent behavior towards me was just escalating. You know, the closer we got to that 3-year mark, it was just, at the end, it got to the point where, I didn't want to be home. You know, I didn't want to be around any of them. But looking back, it wasn't even his behavior that was the hardest to tolerate, but it was the day-to-day waiting. You know, the thinking every day, is today going to be the day? You know, every morning, will this be the day, the last day that I'll have my mom? You know, I can remember coming home from school in those times, and I'd make it as far, I'd get off the bus and I'd make it as far as the corner, you know, and we had like 5 houses off the corner, and there was a fire hydrant, and I'd sit on the fire hydrant and I'd stare at the house, and no matter how hard I willed my legs to pick me up and take me home, they couldn't do it. I couldn't go home, you know. I was always afraid of the things that come that day, or what had already transpired while I was at school, you know. And I knew that if something had happened during the day, I knew in my heart of hearts that he wouldn't come get me. He'd be drunk, you know. So it was is she dead, or is he home drunk alone, and now I have to go face this, you know. That went on for years. It became very hard to just be alive at that time, I guess. You know, it was kind of this last year that I started to practice the same unhealthy coping mechanisms that I was watching my father do, you know. It was what I was being taught. It was kind of being ingrained in me that there wasn't really dealing with anything as much as numbing yourself to it. You know, through this whole time, we never discussed what was going to happen after. None of us, you know. you know, by the end, my mom was unable to have that discussion, and I think my dad was unwilling to, you know. It didn't take long, really, to slip into that really destructive way of dealing with everything, good or bad, you know. Something good would happen, and I didn't know how to handle that either. Somebody would say, good job, Tim, you know, at school, or I played athletics then, and it really felt like I was being slapped in the face because everything else was just so messed up. You know, I couldn't take a compliment, I couldn't, you know, I couldn't really, looking back, I don't think that I could look at myself in the mirror. I mean, really, I could comb my hair, but to look at myself, to look at my eyes in the mirror, I couldn't handle that pressure, and pressure it was. You know, my self-worth had slowly been sucked out of me, or I had given it away, however you want to look at it, you know. It started to where if I couldn't drink it away, or if I couldn't get high enough to get rid of it all, I got violent. I fought. And I was that little kid in school, in sophomore year, that would find the biggest senior and hope that he just pummeled me to the ground, because that's what I felt I deserved. It only took once or twice, and then I was that little crazy kid. Nobody wanted to mess with me, you know, so they all just kind of, he's nuts, leave him alone, you know. But the bad thing was, I was becoming the one thing that I hated and I loathed the most at that time in my life. I was becoming just like my father. You know, I was turning into the very thing that just drove me to utter disgust. This sloppy, drunk, high, violent person. You know, it all came to a head. Kind of a little backstory, I guess, a quick interjection. My mom was Catholic, like I mentioned. My dad was Lutheran and raised in a very strict Lutheran home when he was a kid. Although he wasn't a very religious man, there was, of course, a theological issue there. You know, they never agreed. Neither one of them ever forced it to go to their own church in fear of causing, you know, problems in the home. But I knew that there was a God. I knew that there was a God. You know, I had never experienced a relationship with him. I never, at this point, read the Bible. You know, I had this mixed up belief that somewhere down the road, and thank God it came to fruition, but somewhere down the road, something would happen in my life, and that I would be able to understand these things. But I remember that my very first experience with prayer, and I don't know why, you know, call it a spiritual thing or whatever, but the very first time I truly prayed from my heart was on Good Friday in 1984. And I don't know if it was just a hoopla, you know, we had school off for the week, and I knew it was a religious thing going on, and I was in the back seat of my dad's Ford Pinto. You guys remember those? The little tiny thing, you know, and he was sitting in front. I would never sit in the front with him because I couldn't handle the stench. You know, but I remember sitting in the back. We were on our way home from the pharmacy, my mom's pharmacy, with a big bag of pills, keeping her alive probably. And I remember looking out the window and I remember saying to God, finally for the first time, God, you gotta take her away. I can't do this anymore. I cannot continue to watch my mom just waste away nothing. I mean, at this point she was 70 pounds, 60 pounds. She was just dying at home in a hospital bed because the doctor said they couldn't do anything else. So she was at home. So this was in our face, down our throat, 24/7. So I asked God to take her away. 2 days later, she died on Easter Sunday, after 3 years of waiting. And of course, you know, being 14 and not knowing anything about Jesus Christ, about God, about, you know, just the beautiful triune that I believe in now, I blamed myself. And then I blamed God. I hated everything about the thought of God. I hated myself. I would trash the house when Dad was at the bar, and I would, how could you do this, God? How could you listen to just me? I'm worthless. I'm all these things that I've been told now for 3 years. You know, and it was just, it was, I thought he hated me. I thought I had finally crossed the line, same line that my father I thought I'd crossed, and God hated me, and this is my punishment. You've been a bad son for 3 years, you haven't been able to help your mother, you haven't been there for your father, even though he was drunk and abusing us, or me. So I thought he hated me. Well, as you can imagine, the violence and the drinking shortly after that was just unbearable, you know. We weren't allowed to cry at the funeral. We were told, you know, men don't cry. I remember having a tear in my eye. You know, it was at Cunio's funeral home in the city in Chicago. And I remember stepping out of the car, and I remember just an ever so like, you gotta be there for me, you can't cry, you know? That's what we got. You can't cry. I'll tell you, it was a lot of years before I shed a tear after that. Well, I made it to Thanksgiving of 1984. We'd had some family over, and really, looking back, they came. I don't want to call it pity, you know, because they were my mom's side of the family, and they didn't really, you know, of course, being Catholic, they didn't really approve ever of my mom marrying a non-Catholic. You know, the Italians are very funny that way, especially devout Italians. So it was stressful from Thursday to the weekend. And I don't think Dad slept from Thursday to Saturday morning. I remember multiple scotch bottles, you know. I remember broken furniture. I remember it was hell for me. You know, my brother at this time had moved out. The first and only time he ever moved out of my father's house was through this time. Saturday afternoon. I think I had gotten high that morning with my friends instead of doing what I was told to do, you know. And I remember walking in the front door, and I didn't have the door shut, and he had cuffed me right in the face, and my eyes swelled shut, and I locked myself in the bathroom, and I couldn't cry because men don't cry. I couldn't go back out because I was afraid to go out of the bathroom, you know. So I stayed in the bathroom for hours and hours and hours until I heard nothing in the house. And he was passed out on the living room floor. And I got a green garbage bag off of my kitchen sink. And I took the bottom 3 drawers of my dresser because they were the only ones that still worked, you know, in the house. And I literally dumped them into the garbage bag, and I twisted it up, and I threw it over my shoulder, and it was cold. Let me tell you, it was cold. And I walked out of the house at 14 years old. You know, I bounced around after that. I bounced around, you know, stayed with some friends. Actually, I lived in a friend's basement for months, or without his parents ever knowing, you know. He would just let me in at night. They were drinkers. And he let me in and I'd hide. And he'd, you know, sneak me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or whatever. I continued to go to school when I could, you know. Times were different then. You know, you could miss a few days before they called home. And I don't think Dad ever answered the phone anyways, you know. And then one of my friend's parents got divorced. And he had the party mom, you know. He had the kind of mom that, you know, he'd get back and we'd go over there, and it was safe as long as we were sharing with her. You know, it was the 80s still, you know. Everybody was doing it, so yeah, but they got divorced, and him and his mom were going back to Chicago, which is where they were from, and she had said, you know, if it's okay if your dad can come. I said, a couple days later, oh yeah, he said it was fine, you know. So I took off to Chicago with them, really having no other place to go. You know, and he never looked for me. He never called the police. He never called around to my friend's parents, and we had a phone list down the fridge. I remember it, you know. We had to, or we couldn't leave the house. He